Most policy mistakes announce themselves in ways that allow for reasonable debate about their consequences. A tariff is imposed, economists disagree about its effects, politicians argue about who benefits, and the public is left to sort through competing interpretations of a genuinely complex situation. But occasionally, a decision is made that is so structurally self-defeating, so precisely calibrated to harm the party issuing the threat, at least as much as the party receiving it, that the debate about consequences collapses almost immediately into a debate about basic competence. What happened on January 29, 2026, when Donald Trump announced that he was decertifying all aircraft built in Canada and threatening a 50% tariff on any Canadian plane sold in the United States, belongs to that rarer category. Not because it was the most economically significant move in a year of escalating trade pressure, but because it was the one that most clearly illustrated the gap between the theatrical logic of coercion and the structural logic of interdependence. The moment you understand what 648 flights means, you understand why this particular threat did not land as pressure on Canada. It landed as a problem for the United States, and Carney's response, measured and institutionally precise in the way that has become the signature of his approach to this entire relationship, did not need to be dramatic. It simply needed to be accurate. It was. Let me give you the structural picture that makes this episode so analytically significant, because without that picture, the threat looks merely eccentric rather than genuinely revealing. Canada is one of the world's major aerospace manufacturing centers. Bombardier, headquartered in Montreal, produces a range of business jets and regional aircraft that are embedded throughout the North American aviation system in ways that were not designed to be easily disentangled from the American side of the equation. The company has 3,000 American employees across 9 American facilities. It works with 2,800 American suppliers. More than half of its global fleet of 5,200 aircraft operates in the United States. 2/3 of its total revenue comes from American customers. And the regional jets it produces, the CRJ family that has been the workhorse of American regional aviation for decades, are operated by the feeder airlines that serve American Airlines, Delta, and United, connecting smaller American cities to the major hub airports that anchor the national air travel system. When Trump announced that he was decertifying all aircraft built in Canada, what he was threatening, if carried out in its most literal form, was the grounding of 648 passenger jets currently in active service with American regional carriers. Those planes make more than 2,600 flights every single day. They carry 175,000 available passenger seats across routes that connect American communities to the national aviation grid. Many of those routes serve smaller cities and rural areas, the kind of communities that have been central to the political coalition that has supported the tariff agenda since it began. And unlike the abstract economic harm of higher prices for imported goods, the grounding of commercial aircraft has the particular quality of being immediate, visible, and impossible to attribute to anything other than the policy decision that caused it. You cannot tell a passenger stranded at a regional airport that the temporary disruption is a necessary price for restoring American manufacturing competitiveness. There is no messaging framework that makes that argument work. I want to be precise about what the administration actually announced, because the coverage was not always careful about the distinction between the threat as stated and the threat as legally executable. Trump's social media post said he was decertifying the Bombardier Global Express and all aircraft made in Canada. A White House official subsequently clarified, after the aviation industry's reaction made the consequences unmistakable, that the decertification would apply to new aircraft rather than planes already in operation. That clarification matters enormously for the immediate impact on American air travel. The 648 regional jets currently flying American routes were not going to be immediately grounded under the administration's own subsequent interpretation. But the clarification, arriving as it did after the initial announcement, had already caused Bombardier's stock to dive and triggered alarm across the entire American regional aviation sector, illustrates something important about how this kind of threat operates in practice. The damage to confidence, to investment planning, to the commercial relationships between Canadian manufacturers and their American customers does not require the most extreme version of the threat to be executed. It requires only that the threat be credibly made and that the actors who depend on the affected systems begin adjusting their behavior in response to the uncertainty it creates. The pretext for the announcement is worth examining carefully because it reveals the particular kind of institutional reasoning that has characterized much of this trade confrontation. Trump claimed that Canada had wrongfully, illegally, and steadfastly refused to certify a series of Gulfstream business jets, the 500, 600, 700, and 800 models manufactured by Gulfstream, which is a unit of General Dynamics, the American defense contractor. The certification process for aircraft sold in Canada is administered by Transport Canada, the equivalent of the Federal Aviation Administration, and follows international aviation safety standards that are shared across the major regulatory systems. Canada had not certified the Gulfstream models in question because the certification process had not been completed to the standard required by its regulatory framework. This is not an unusual situation in international aviation. Certification processes take time, require documentation, and are subject to technical review that does not move on political timelines. The FAA itself maintains standards that foreign aircraft must meet before they can operate in American airspace, and those standards are enforced regardless of the diplomatic relationship between the United States and the country of manufacture. What Trump was essentially demanding was that Canada bypass its own aviation safety certification process under threat of having its aerospace industry targeted with punitive tariffs and having its aircraft removed from the American certification framework. The demand placed Canadian aviation authorities in the position of either compromising the integrity of a safety process that protects Canadian passengers and airspace, or accepting the economic consequences of refusing to do so. Carney's response did not engage with the merits of the Gulfstream certification dispute in technical detail. It did not need to. What it did was to direct Canada's transportation minister to speak directly with Bombardier's chief executive and with senior leadership at General Dynamics, the American parent company, while simultaneously reaffirming that Canada's aviation industry was safe and reliable and that the government would stand behind it. The operational message was clear without being confrontational. This dispute will be resolved through the proper institutional channels, not through the application of trade pressure to a safety regulatory process, and Canada is not going to compromise its certification standards because a social media post demands it. But the deeper strategic message of Canada's response was something that requires a bit more analytical attention to fully appreciate. By directing its transportation minister to engage directly with General Dynamics, the American corporation that owns Gulfstream and that has its own reasons for wanting the certification dispute resolved through orderly processes rather than through the kind of escalation that could damage the broader bilateral aviation relationship, Canada was doing something that has become a consistent feature of Carney's approach to the entire trade confrontation. It was identifying the American private sector actors whose interests diverge from the administration's stated position and engaging with them directly. General Dynamics has 3,000 employees in Canadian facilities through its Gulfstream division. Bombardier has 3,000 employees in American facilities. These are not adversarial interests. They are deeply intertwined commercial relationships whose mutual profitability depends on the kind of regulatory stability and predictable market access that trade confrontations systematically undermine. When Canada's minister reaches out to Bombardier's CEO and to General Dynamics leadership simultaneously, it is communicating something important. The path to resolving this dispute runs through the commercial relationship, not through the tariff mechanism that is threatening it. There is a financial dimension to the aircraft threat that deserves its own careful attention before we move to the broader strategic picture, because the market reaction was itself a form of institutional communication that tells you something important about how the investment community reads these episodes. Bombardier's stock dove immediately upon the announcement, which was the predictable response of a market pricing in the risk that a major revenue source had suddenly been placed in political jeopardy. But the more revealing market signal was what happened in the hours that followed, as the scope of the actual threat became clearer and the White House began walking back the most extreme interpretation of the decertification language. The stock partially recovered. Not because the threat had been fully withdrawn, but because investors concluded that the full execution of the threat was structurally impossible given the dependence of the American regional aviation system on the planes it purported to decertify. That recovery tells you something about how sophisticated capital markets currently assess American trade threats in general. They have developed a discount factor. They no longer price the most extreme interpretation of a threat as the likely outcome, because the pattern of the past year has established that threats regularly exceed what can actually be executed without unacceptable self-harm. That discount factor is itself a form of leverage erosion. When the credibility of a threat has been reduced to the point where markets immediately begin calculating the gap between what is announced and what can actually be implemented, the coercive power of the threat has been substantially diminished even before any formal response is made. Now I want to connect the aircraft episode to the broader pattern of the past year's trade confrontation, because this is where the analytical picture becomes most revealing about the trajectory of American leverage in the relationship. What the Bombardier announcement had in common with the Gordie Howe Bridge demand, the 100% tariff threat over the China trade arrangement, the decertification of all Canadian-made aircraft, what all of these episodes share, is a particular structural characteristic. Each of them, when examined carefully rather than at the surface level of the political theater, imposed costs on American interests that were at least as significant as the costs they were designed to impose on Canada. The bridge threat alarmed Michigan's entire political class, including Republican members of Congress from the state who had previously been reliable supporters of the tariff agenda. The 100% tariff threat over China would, if executed, have raised prices across an enormous range of consumer goods at precisely the moment when the administration was trying to demonstrate that it was addressing the affordability concerns of American households. And the aircraft decertification threat put at risk the operational integrity of a regional aviation system that serves the American communities, smaller cities, rural areas, economically stressed regions, whose political support has been the foundation of the coalition that produced and sustains the tariff agenda. This is the central paradox of a coercive trade strategy applied to a relationship as deeply integrated as the one between the United States and Canada. The leverage that is supposed to come from threatening economic harm to the other party is systematically undercut by the structural reality that the two economies are intertwined in ways that make it very difficult to harm one without harming the other. You cannot threaten to decertify Canadian aircraft without threatening the American regional air system that depends on those aircraft. You cannot threaten the bridge that connects Windsor to Detroit without threatening the supply chains that flow through that crossing and that sustain manufacturing employment on the American side of the river. You cannot threaten a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods without threatening the American consumers who buy those goods and the American industries whose production depends on Canadian inputs. The threat always travels in both directions, and a government that is skilled at reading those structural interdependencies will always find ways to make the return journey of the threat visible in ways that complicate the political sustainability of the original demand. Canada has been doing exactly that, with increasing sophistication as the confrontation has continued. Not by manufacturing counter-threats, not by escalating the rhetorical temperature, but by making sure that the structural consequences of each American escalation are clearly visible to the American constituencies that will ultimately determine whether the escalation is politically sustainable. Carney's measured response to the aircraft threat, engage with the commercial relationships, affirm the safety standards, refuse to compromise the regulatory process, is designed to let the structural logic do the work. And the structural logic is doing it. Bombardier's American employees are talking to their representatives. The regional airline associations are talking to the FAA. Michigan politicians who depend on the automotive supply chains that flow through the Windsor-Detroit corridor are paying attention. The American companies that use Bombardier regional jets to connect their hub systems to smaller markets are calculating what it would cost them to replace or reroute those services. None of this requires Ottawa to make a dramatic public statement. It requires only that the structural consequences of the threat be visible enough to mobilize the American private sector and political interests that have a stake in seeing it resolved. Let me be direct about what I find most institutionally significant about the entire aircraft episode, because I think it reveals something about the current American trade posture that is easy to miss in the daily accumulation of specific incidents. The Gulfstream certification dispute had been a genuine commercial irritant in the Canada-United States aviation relationship for some time before it became a social media proclamation of decertification. There is, in other words, a real underlying issue. American aircraft manufacturers want access to the Canadian certification process, and there are legitimate commercial interests on both sides of the question. The institutional mechanism for resolving that kind of dispute exists, It involves the aviation regulatory agencies of both countries, the diplomatic channels maintained for exactly this kind of bilateral technical negotiation, and the commercial relationships between the affected manufacturers. None of those mechanisms move as quickly as a social media post, but they produce outcomes that are durable, technically defensible, and consistent with the safety standards that protect passengers on both sides of the border. When a trade threat is deployed as a substitute for that institutional process, it does not accelerate the resolution of the underlying dispute. It complicates it. It transforms a technical regulatory question into a political confrontation, which makes it harder for the agencies responsible for the certification decision to make that decision on technical grounds without it being read as a capitulation to political pressure. And it damages the broader framework of regulatory cooperation between the two countries in ways that persist long after the specific incident has passed. Every time a safety certification process is treated as a bargaining chip, the reliability of the entire framework of bilateral regulatory cooperation is called into question. And that framework is the invisible architecture that makes North American aviation work, that allows Canadian planes to fly in American airspace, and American planes to fly in Canadian airspace, that underpins the commercial relationships between manufacturers, operators, and regulators on both sides of the border. Carney's response to the aircraft threat was, at its core, a defense of that architecture. Not through confrontation, not through counter threats, but through the deliberate reaffirmation that Canada would engage with the substance of the dispute through the proper institutional channels, while declining to allow the trade confrontation to compromise the integrity of the regulatory process. That posture is easy to underestimate if you're looking for the dramatic gesture, the pointed speech, the visible act of resistance that generates headlines. It is very difficult to underestimate if you understand that the institutions being defended are the actual source of the stability that makes the relationship functional. You can generate a great deal of political theater by threatening to decertify 648 flights. You cannot generate durable economic relationships by doing so. And durable economic relationships, in the end, are what both countries need from the North American aviation system. The argument that the threat was supposed to ground was Canada's claim that its regulatory institutions are sound, its certification standards are legitimate, and its aviation industry deserves to be treated as the sophisticated and deeply integrated partner of the American aviation system that it actually is. That argument was not grounded by the threat, it was reinforced by it. Because the moment the practical consequences of the decertification announcement became clear to the American aviation industry, the argument made itself. 648 planes, 2,600 daily flights, 175,000 passenger seats. The structural case for Canadian aerospace as an indispensable partner of American aviation is written in those numbers, and no social media post, however emphatic, has the power to erase it. History reserves its sharpest judgments not for the leaders who failed to achieve their goals, but for those who constructed the conditions for their own reversal. When the threat exposes your dependency more clearly than your power, and when markets begin discounting your announcements before the ink is dry, the strategic calculation has already been lost. The 648 flights were never in serious danger of being grounded, but the credibility of the threat that was supposed to ground them took a hit from which it will not easily recover.